one of the greatest novelists in history, a genius who could understand the darkest corners of the human soul. Yet, when it came to the Turks, he often used an extremely harsh, angry, and even hateful language. But why? Did Dostoevsky truly hate the Turks? Or did the word Turk in his mind become a symbol of something much bigger? The Ottoman Empire, Islam, Russia's historical enemy, and the fears of his own ideology. In this video, we will break down the real reasons behind Dostoevsky's hostility toward the Turks, the political climate of 19th century Russia, the Balkan crisis, Orthodox Slavism, and the imperial ambitions that shaped his worldview. And by the end of this video, we'll answer one question clearly. Was Dostoevsky's hatred personal, or was it the product of the toxic ideologies of his time? When people hear the name Dostoevsky, they usually think of Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Gambler, or Notes from Underground. They think of unforgettable characters, deep psychological conflict, and a writer who could explore the darkest parts of human nature like almost no one else. But there is something many people forget. Dostoevsky was not only a novelist, he was also a political writer, a journalist, and a man deeply involved in the ideological struggles of his time. And this is exactly where the question of the Turks begins. Because Dostoevsky's harsh attitude toward the Turks does not mainly appear in his novels, it appears much more clearly in his political writings, especially in A Writer's Diary, where he wrote passionately about current events, religion, nationalism, Russia's role in the world, and the Ottoman Empire. So, when we talk about his hostility toward the Turks, we are not only talking about a literary genius, we're also talking about a man shaped by the political, religious, and imperial mindset of late 19th century Russia. To understand this, we need to look at the Russia of his time. In the 19th century, one of the biggest questions among Russian intellectuals was this: was Russia truly part of Europe, or was it something entirely different, a civilization with its own destiny, separate from and perhaps even superior to the West? This was not just a cultural debate, it was a civilizational argument that shaped politics, identity, and foreign policy. On one side were the Westernizers. They believed Russia should modernize, adopt European institutions, and move closer to Western civilization. On the other side were the Slavophiles and nationalist thinkers, who believed that Russia's true strength lay not in Europe, but in its own people, its Orthodox faith, and its distinct spiritual mission. Dostoevsky moved closer and closer to that second worldview in the later years of his life. He began to see Russia not as an ordinary country, but as a nation with a sacred historical mission. In his eyes, Russia was meant to guide humanity spiritually. And once a thinker begins to see his nation in those terms, every obstacle in its path can start to look like more than a political rival. It can begin to look like a moral enemy. And this is where the Turks and the Ottoman Empire entered Dostoevsky's imagination. But there is an important detail here. When Dostoevsky used the word Turk, he often was not speaking in the narrow modern ethnic sense. In his mind, the Turk often represented Ottoman rule, Muslim power, Russia's historical enemy, and the fears of his own ideology. In other words, he was not responding to individual Turkish people he knew personally. He was responding to a large symbolic enemy that had taken shape inside his ideological world, and that is where hatred begins to harden. The moment you stop seeing a people as human beings with complexity and start seeing them as a historical obstacle, a threatening force, or a dark symbol in a civilizational struggle, you are no longer confronting reality. You are confronting an image. And in many ways, that is exactly what Dostoevsky was doing. But this anger did not come only from ideas. It was also fueled by a very real historical crisis, because by the late 19th century, the Balkans were exploding, and in Russia, public rage against the Ottoman Empire was growing fast. The Balkan crisis, the Ottoman Empire, and the hardening of hatred. To understand Dostoevsky's hostility toward the Turks, we have to understand the historical stage on which this hostility was formed. In the 19th century, one of Europe's biggest geopolitical problems was what became known as the Eastern Question. The Ottoman Empire was weakening, nationalist uprisings were spreading in the Balkans, and the great powers of Europe were fighting for influence in the region. Russia presented itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians and Slavic peoples living under Ottoman rule. Serbs, Bulgarians, Montenegrins, and other groups were often described in Russia as brotherly peoples. But this was not just about compassion. Behind this language of brotherhood stood major geopolitical interests. control over the Black Sea, access to the Mediterranean, influence over the Balkans, and above all, the dream of reaching or dominating Constantinople. So the emotional language of Slavic solidarity was mixed with hard imperial ambition. When violence in the Balkans escalated, especially during the Bulgarian crisis, reports of massacres and suffering spread across Europe and Russia. In the Russian public sphere, anger toward the Ottoman Empire intensified dramatically. Writers, journalists, intellectuals, and politicians framed the conflict in moral terms. It was no longer just politics. It was presented as a struggle between civilization and barbarism, between Christian victims and Muslim oppressors. Dostoevsky became one of the most passionate voices in that atmosphere. He did not write about the Ottoman Empire in a detached or analytical way. He wrote with fire. He saw the struggle as a moral crusade. In his writings, Ottoman rule often became more than just a political system. It became a symbol of cruelty, barbarity, and historical evil. And here is the critical shift. Criticism of Ottoman policy often expanded into a generalized hostility toward the Turk as a whole. And this is where the real problem begins. It is one thing to criticize an empire, its rule, or its violence. It is something very different to turn an entire people into a symbol of barbarism. But Dostoevsky often crossed that line. In his writing, the Turk stopped being a real human being and became the dark enemy standing against Slavic and Orthodox liberation. That symbolic transformation made his language much harsher. And then came Pan-Slavism. Pan-Slavism was the idea that Slavic peoples should unite culturally, politically, and spiritually. On the surface, it sounds romantic, a vision of shared identity and brotherhood. But in practice, especially in the context of Russian power, it often meant something else. Russia would lead, Russia would rescue, and Russia would shape the future of the Slavic world. Dostoevsky deeply embraced this idea. He saw Russia not only as the friend of the Slavs, but as their historical savior. That meant the struggle against Ottoman rule was not just military or political in his eyes. It became sacred, moral, and civilizational. The Turks were no longer just another state or another people. They became, in his imagination, the force standing in the way of a higher historical mission. And then came Constantinople. For Dostoevsky, Constantinople was not just a city, it was a symbol of orthodoxy, of Byzantium, of historical inheritance, and of Russia's imperial destiny. In some of his writings, he openly suggested that Constantinople should belong to Russia. At that point, this was no longer simply outrage against Ottoman violence, it was imperial desire. So, what do we see here? We see a man who believed the Ottoman Empire represented oppression and darkness. We see a man who believed Russia represented salvation and spiritual destiny. And when those two ideas collide, the result is obvious. The Turks become not merely political rivals, but almost metaphysical enemies, the obstacle blocking Russia's path through history. And once a people are turned into an obstacle, they are no longer seen as people. They become symbols, and symbols are much easier to hate. But politics alone does not explain Dostoevsky's hostility. There was another layer to it: religion, orthodoxy, Russian identity, and the way Islam came to be positioned in his worldview. Orthodoxy, Islam, and the Turk as a symbol. In Dostoevsky's later worldview, religion stood at the center of everything. He increasingly saw Russia not just as a state, but as the last true guardian of authentic Christianity, especially Orthodox Christianity. This made the Ottoman Empire more than a geopolitical rival. It made it the Muslim power ruling over lands and peoples that Dostoevsky believed belonged spiritually to the Orthodox world. This is where the image of the Turk hardened even more, because political rivalry and religious difference began to merge into one single picture. Ottoman power was not just foreign rule, it was Muslim rule over Christians. And in Dostoevsky's imagination, that gave the conflict a deeper, more sacred meaning. This matters because once religion enters the conflict, The enemy is no longer seen simply as a competitor. He becomes an adversary of truth, faith, and civilization itself. And yet, there is a major irony here. Dostoevsky did not know Turks or Muslims in any deep personal sense. His understanding of the Ottoman world was shaped much more by war reports, Russian public discourse, nationalist ideas, and inherited historical myths than by personal experience. In other words, he was reacting less to real Turkish individuals and more to a constructed image, a symbolic Turk created by politics, religion, and empire. And that distinction is crucial. Because sometimes hatred is strongest not toward people we know, but toward people we have imagined, people we have turned into symbols. That is what seems to have happened in Dostoevsky's case. The Turk in his writings often represents more than an actual nation or population. It becomes a dark civilizational figure, the enemy of Orthodox Christians, the ruler of Constantinople, the obstacle to Slavic liberation, and the force standing against Russia's sacred historical mission. But there is another layer. Dostoevsky's anger toward the Turks was also tied to his anger toward the West. He deeply resented the way Western powers, especially Britain and France, supported or protected the Ottoman Empire when it suited their interests. To him, this looked like hypocrisy. Christian Europe, in his eyes, was willing to side with the Turk against Russia for the sake of power and strategy. So the Turk, in Dostoevsky's worldview, was not only Russia's enemy in the East, he was also part of a larger story in which Russia felt surrounded, betrayed, and blocked by rival civilizations. By this point, his hatred had several layers. First, political hostility. The Ottoman Empire was Russia's longtime geopolitical rival. Second, religious hostility. Orthodox identity and Muslim power were cast as opposites. Third, civilizational superiority. Russia was imagined as the redeemer, while the Turk was cast as the force of darkness or backwardness. Fourth, imperial ambition. Especially in the question of Constantinople, anti-Turkish feeling was tied directly to Russian dreams of expansion. So when we ask, why did Dostoevsky hate the Turks? The most accurate answer is this. He did not simply hate Turks as individuals. He hated what the Turk had come to symbolize in his ideological universe: Ottoman domination, Muslim rule, resistance to Slavic liberation, and the blockage of Russia's sacred historical mission. And that does not make his hatred less serious. In fact, it makes it more dangerous. Because when you hate real people, there is at least the possibility that experience might challenge your prejudice. But when you hate a symbol, the hatred can become absolute. Symbols do not speak back. They do not humanize themselves. They remain fixed in the imagination, dark and convenient. That is what seems to have happened in Dostoevsky's case. The Turk in his writings often represents more than an actual nation or population. It becomes a dark civilizational figure, the enemy of Orthodox Christians, the ruler of Constantinople, the obstacle to Slavic liberation, and the force standing against Russia's sacred historical mission. But there is another layer. Dostoevsky's anger toward the Turks was also tied to his anger toward the West. He deeply resented the way Western powers, especially Britain and France, supported or protected the Ottoman Empire when it suited their interests. To him, this looked like hypocrisy. Christian Europe, in his eyes, was willing to side with the Turk against Russia for the sake of power and strategy. So the Turk, in Dostoevsky's worldview, was not only Russia's enemy in the East, he was also part of a larger story in which Russia felt surrounded, betrayed, and blocked by rival civilizations. By this point, his hatred had several layers. First, political hostility. The Ottoman Empire was Russia's longtime geopolitical rival. Second, religious hostility. Orthodox identity and Muslim power were cast as opposites. Third, civilizational superiority. Russia was imagined as the redeemer, while the Turk was cast as the force of darkness or backwardness. Fourth, imperial ambition. Especially in the question of Constantinople, anti-Turkish feeling was tied directly to Russian dreams of expansion. So when we ask, why did Dostoevsky hate the Turks? The most accurate answer is this. He did not simply hate Turks as individuals. He hated what the Turk had come to symbolize in his ideological universe: Ottoman domination, Muslim rule, resistance to Slavic liberation, and the blockage of Russia's sacred historical mission. And that does not make his hatred less serious. In fact, it makes it more dangerous. Because when you hate real people, there is at least the possibility that experience might challenge your prejudice. But when you hate a symbol, the hatred can become absolute. Symbols do not speak back. They do not humanize themselves. They remain fixed in the imagination, dark and convenient. That is why Dostoevsky's hostility toward the Turks was not just emotional, it was ideological, it was symbolic. It was woven into the way he understood history itself. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. How could a man who understood guilt, suffering, doubt, and redemption so deeply fail so completely when looking at an entire people? Perhaps the answer is simple. Great literary genius does not guarantee moral clarity. A writer can be brilliant in art and blind in politics. Dostoevsky was a giant of literature, but that did not protect him from the nationalist, religious, and imperial passions of his age. And in the case of the Turks, he did not rise above those passions. He surrendered to them. Dostoevsky's story teaches us something important. A person can be a genius in literature and still be deeply unfair in politics. In fact, some of the greatest writers in history were also prisoners of the fears, propaganda, and hatreds of their own time. Dostoevsky's attitude toward the Turks is one of those cases. He was a master at understanding the human soul, but when it came to Turks and Muslims, he often stopped seeing human beings and started seeing a historical symbol, an obstacle, an enemy, a dark figure in Russia's grand story. And that is where hatred truly begins. Not when you face real people, but when you replace them with a myth. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Admiring a great writer is one thing, recognizing his prejudices is another. To take Dostoevsky seriously does not mean blindly praising him. It also means being honest about where he was wrong. Yes, Dostoevsky was one of the greatest novelists who ever lived, but that does not excuse his hostility toward the Turks. And history has shown us again and again, the moment a people are reduced to a symbol, justice disappears. And that is exactly what happened here.